In listening to Bible preachers, I come from an evangelical background, and there are many wonderful Bible teachers and preachers who are conservative that I enjoy the Bible study, but every one of them, whenever they start talking about homosexuality, to use as a proof text that God hates homosexuals and does not approve of homosexuality, they invariably bring up this story that we just shared here today of Sodom and Gomorrah as a proof biblical text that God does not approve of and hates homosexuals. Every time I've ever discussed gay issues with some very good friends who are wonderful ministers, they're Christians and they're wonderful Bible teachers and preachers, but they always, when the subject of homosexuality comes up, mention Sodom and Gomorrah, and yet all these various sins of Sodom and abominations committed in Sodom and Gomorrah that are reiterated specifically in the scripture, they never mention them. They only mention Sodom and Gomorrah in connection with homosexuality. They say that God destroyed the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah because of homosexuality, and they are totally, completely dead wrong. A few years ago in Portland, when the county had said that gay couples could be married, and they were lined up down the street at the county to get marriage licenses, several hundreds of gay couples, there were some evangelical, what I call right-wing lunatic fringe Bible bangers out there protesting gay people's right to be married. And I can still see it on television, the guy standing up there with the Bible talking about Sodom and Gomorrah and telling these gay couples that God, because of people like them, God burned them to a crisp. That was his words in Sodom and Gomorrah. Telling these gay couples that wanted to get married that people like them, God destroyed and burned to a crisp, and cited Sodom and Gomorrah to condemn the gay couples that were lining up for marriage license. Now, arguing that Genesis 19, the scripture we just read, is God's indictment of homosexuality is as ridiculous as arguing that the sexual sins outlined in Genesis 34, Judges 19, and 2 Samuel 13 are God's indictment of heterosexuality. That's right. Arguing that Genesis 19 is God's indictment of homosexuality is as ridiculous as arguing that the sexual sins in these other scriptures are God's indictment of heterosexuality. The context of all these passages is not whether somebody's homosexual or heterosexual. The content of all these passages is rape, worship of false gods, unclean, blasphemous sacrifices, sex with angels, and even with animals. And these sins are equally as bad whether they are committed by a heterosexual or homosexual persons. There always have been in all cultures since the beginning of time homosexuals who have been closeted because obviously in the culture they lived in they didn't dare come out. But these sins that are listed that I just mentioned, rape, worship of false gods and unclean sacrifices, and sex with angels are equally as bad whether committed by homosexuals or heterosexuals. And a person's innate sexual orientation is never listed as a sin in any of these scriptures. That's right. A person's innate sexual orientation is never listed as a sin in any of these scriptures. Now, you know, I want to stop for just a second, and when I preach, sometimes I study and do a manuscript, and other times I speak spontaneously. Today is kind of a combination of the two, and and some of the reference material I got from the sermon, you'll be able to go onto my webpage and get the books that I got some of these things out of, which go into far more detail than I could in this hour-long show. For those men to stand out there in Portland with the same-sex couples lining up for marriage licenses and saying that God would burn them to a crisp like he did Sodom and Gomorrah, you know, is so totally off the chart and so wrong. It's just incredible that they could take this story to justify not God's hatred of gay people, but their hatred of gay people who are made and created in God's own image. I just thought of that right now. There they talk about God hating homosexuals and using Sodom and Gomorrah as an example when nothing could be further from the truth. It isn't God that hates the homosexuals, it's these evangelical Bible people that stand out there and rant and rave and preach hatred using Sodom and Gomorrah as an excuse. They're the ones that hate homosexuals, not God.